Welcome. I'm Frank Gaffney, the president of the Center for Security Policy. We're very pleased to be sponsoring our program today, which is, to my way of thinking, kind of a follow-on to an earlier program that the center convened back in February of 2015 for the purposes of introducing a product we call the Secure Freedom Strategy. It was a product, as many of our efforts are, of a joint collaborative initiative to try to devise something that has been clearly absent to date in our struggles with what we think of as the global jihad movement. It is a multinational, multifaceted, dynamic, and increasingly dangerous enterprise animated by the Islamic supremacist doctrine of Sharia, and coming at us now, unfortunately, we fear, emboldened by the lack of a strategy by the United States and much of the rest of the Western world. Full bore on our friends in Israel, but also now increasingly in Europe, and I fear, if not immediately, certainly in due course here in the United States. So the Secure Freedom Strategy was an initiative that we came up with to try to adapt a strategy that actually had worked in the past against a totalitarian adversary, namely Soviet communism, devised by President Ronald Reagan and implemented with great effect, as history now makes clear. This all instruments of national power strategy brought to bear against that day's foe brought about the end of the Soviet Union and ushered in an era of opportunity for a very different world, a world in which, if not absolute and enduring peace, at least there was an opportunity for freedom to prosper and survive. That has now become much more problematic as a result of events, particularly in the past 10 years, 15 years, but it seems at an accelerating pace these days. So we're very pleased to convene a panel of 3 distinguished authorities on the subject to share with us different vantage points, different perspectives on how the global jihad movement is manifesting itself these days and what are the implications of our persistent failure to both understand the nature of the enemy and to devise and implement an effective strategy against it. Among the people we will be hearing from are 2 authors. The first will be the former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, now the Shulman Senior Fellow at a marvelous organization here in Washington, D.C., the Investigative Project on Terrorism. He is former Congressman Pete Hoekstra of Michigan. He is the author of a new book, Architects of Disaster: The Destruction of Libya. Congressman Hoekstra will talk a little bit about, I believe, the insights that he's gleaned from his analysis of the Libyan debacle, who should be held accountable for it, and lessons that we should be learning from it. And then we will turn to his 2 colleagues to round out the panel with other aspects of this, what I call war for the free world. Congressman Hoekstra, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Frank, and thanks for hosting this conference to talk about this issue. And what I find most interesting is that we are doing this the week that the White House said the architects of disaster, Josh Ernst, said, he's got it all wrong. And so we're sending Josh a copy of the book so that maybe he can read the book and get a perspective of what really happened in Libya. And the conversation started this week when he was asked by John Gizzi of Newsmax about whether the president, the former Secretary of State, believed that removing Gaddafi was actually a good move. And after stumbling around for about 5 minutes, he never really answered the question. But let me provide a perspective on this, and it's really why I wrote the book, because I really do believe that this is a situation of where we as a country snatched defeat out of the jaws of victory. And as Frank indicated when he started, against the former Soviet Union, we had a long strategy in place to confront, contain, and ultimately defeat the former Soviet Union. The interesting thing here is that, that was through Republican and Democrat administrations, and you kind of worked within a certain framework. You kind of expected that if there was a Democrat administration, you might be over a little bit more on this side of the framework. If there was a Republican president, you'd move a little bit further over, you'd move to a different part of the framework, but you had this box that you worked in. And the former Soviet Union saw that we were committed to containing and ultimately defeating them. They knew who we were and where we stood. In 2003, I was asked by one of my colleagues on the Intelligence Committee at that time to go visit Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. He came up to me on the floor and said, "Hey, Pete, do you want to go see Muammar Gaddafi?" No, I don't, not really. I have no interest in going to see Gaddafi, because at that point in time, the framework was still Gaddafi is evil, the bombing of the discotheque in Germany, the takedown of Pan Am 103, and there was just a small group of people inside the Bush administration that recognized that after 20, 30 years of consistent American foreign policy, of containing and confronting with the ultimate objective of defeating Gaddafi, was actually starting to bear some fruit. That Republican and Democrat administrations, by keeping the pressure on this guy, were just about at the point of getting him to flip. And as my colleague explained that to me and said, actually the Bush administration wants us to go there to meet with Gaddafi and determine whether, as much as you can, as to whether he's sincere about wanting to change his behavior. And so we went. We spent 6 hours driving all across the desert of Libya, driving up to the Med. Being from Michigan, I'm thinking, wow, there's not a lot of nice lakefront property here that's not built on. I bet it's not going for $10,000 a foot, lineal foot, like it is on Lake Michigan. I need to buy some property here. It's pretty nice. But finally, we had the opportunity to meet Gaddafi. We're driving down the desert, and all of a sudden, up on the horizon, there's this big circus tent. And that's where we end up meeting with Gaddafi. We spend about an hour and a half with Muammar, and we leave. We report back to the White House that, there may be some substance, as much as you can get out of an hour and a half meeting, but there may be some substance, and this guy really is concerned, number one, about his own survival. This isn't, hey, I'm all of a sudden against jihad, I want Western-style democracy, and I'm going to liberate my people, and we're going to have human rights, and, I've seen the light. It's kind of like, I've seen the light, and if I keep going down the path I'm going, I'm going to end up like Saddam Hussein, which was not a very good alternative to him. So it's kind of like, I'm thinking I'm willing to engage with the United States about how I can change my behavior. I know that you guys are serious. And so I have the opportunity to meet with him 2 more times between 2003 and 2009. So ultimately, I meet with him on 3 different occasions, 3 different congressional trips to Libya. And by the time we went on our 3rd trip, I'm there with the minority leader at that time, John Boehner. We're meeting with him, and it's clear this guy has now totally flipped his orientation towards radical jihad. By that time, he's given up his nuke program. Excuse me. He's given up his nuke program, and it doesn't mean that we have the same kind of thing that we had recently with Iran, where we had to come up with a Rube Goldberg scheme of trying to find out whether they were still, whether they're meeting the requirements of the agreement or not, or whether they're violating an agreement. And you got this going on and all these different moving pieces. With Gaddafi, it's very, very easy. With Libya, it's very easy. If you want to see Libya's nuke program and the status of its nuke program today, all you need to do is you need to go to this big warehouse somewhere down south, because his nuke program was crated up, shipped to the United States. Our Secretary of Energy, Spence Abraham, didn't have to come up with this scheme to kind of check the ground and check the air and all of these kinds of things. He received the crates. It's now sitting they're now sitting, the parts of the nuke program, they're now sitting in a warehouse next to the Ark of the Covenant from Indiana Jones. All right? And so if Gaddafi wants to reconstitute, or anybody wants to reconstitute a program, they can go and they can find, if they can find those crates, they'll also find the Ark of the Covenant. The other thing that he did is, what else did he do? He paid reparations to the victims of the families of his previous terrorist activities. So the families of the victims in Pan Am 103 received a financial compensation, reparation for his terrorist activities. That in no way, absolves him of the blame for what happened and the murder of the people on those planes. But at this point in time, that is all that is left for him to do. And then for eight years, he integrates and takes his military, but more importantly, his intelligence networks, and he starts working with our military and intelligence network to give us an insight into what is going on in the radical jihadist movement. And why is that important? It's important because this guy has been fighting radical jihadists for decades. If you take a look at Libya, you'll see 2 cities. You'll see Derna, and the city we all have heard a lot about, Benghazi. Well, on a per capita basis, these cities, this little northeast corner of Libya, provided on a per capita basis more fighters to Al-Qaeda and radical jihadist groups than any place else in the Middle East. So when you're hearing about al-Libi, so-and-so al-Libi fighting the U.S. in Afghanistan, fighting the U.S. In Iraq, al-Libi just simply means from Libya. And so these were the folks that we were fighting. And he'd been fighting these folks for years. And so he's the one that can provide us the insight, helped us find some of them, helped us interrogate some of them, and helped give us some insights into who these folks were. So that is the Gaddafi that we saw evolve, and I saw evolve from 2003 and 2009. But again, it is the recognition of a policy that was in place for over 30 years to make that happen. The interesting thing is, if you go back to the statement, let me go back to what Josh Earnest said earlier this week. And they said, well, was Gaddafi an ally? And he says, well, there were certain times where he's an ally, there were certain times when he wasn't, but in some, he was a bad guy. And it's kind of like, well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. If you take what he did before 2003 and you take what he did after 2003, we now have a new president in town that says, this is a bad, the scale here is negative, we need to take him out. Whereas the whole time he was a bad guy, under Reagan, under Bush, Clinton. No one ever thought about taking him out. The only time we thought about taking him out was after 2003, where he was an ally that actually started to level the scale a little bit. And so in total, people can reach different conclusions as to whether he was a good guy or a bad guy. But the bottom line is, when we decided to take him out, he was doing everything we had asked him to do and had been doing it for 8 or 9 years. In helping, as Frank said, to develop a broad strategy of isolating and confronting the threat that we face today. A situation where 14 years after 9/11, we are worse strategically than where we were on 9/11. The threat to us, to our allies in Israel, to Western Europe today is greater than what it was today, than what it was. It's greater today than what it was then. The second interesting thing here is that Josh said, well, you know, and I'm using his comments, number one, because it's nice that the White House is actually reacting to a book that you wrote, which means they at least have noticed it. But the second thing is because I think it shows the totality of how they still don't understand what they did there. And he said, well, you know, Gaddafi has American blood on his hands. It's kind of like, yep, that's right. He's got American blood, he's got Western European blood on his hands, and he also has, Libyan blood on his hands. He did a lot of bad things. But who did we ally with? We allied with folks who have blood on their hands much more recently. This president, as he did in Egypt, as he's done in Iran, as he's done in Syria, has decided that in America's best interest, he believes that he can manage, work with, but most importantly, he believed that because of the power of his personality, the radical jihadist movement would fundamentally change their view of America and would change their behavior. Here's what he said in 2007 as he's running for president. I truly believe that the day I'm inaugurated, not only the country looks at itself differently, but the world looks at America differently. Think about that. That just because we have a new person in the White House, fundamentally everybody else in the world is going to change their worldview because of Barack Obama. They are going to change their view of national self-interest because, oh wow, you know, Iran, yeah, we can change our view on our nuclear program. The radical jihadist movement, yeah, we'll change our view of America because, wow, they have a new president. They have a new president, and they can change their worldview because they understand that I've lived in a Muslim country. And I may be a Christian, but I understand their point of view. Oh, and this is important. My sister is half Indonesian. So based on that is that he's lived in a Muslim country, his sister is half Indonesian, and he's traveled there. It's now time these people will look at America differently. And so I can change, again, a decades-long strategy of Republican and Democrat administrations that says, we recognize who the enemy is, we will not deal with them, we will confront them, we will contain them, and we will defeat them. But now that I'm president, we will change that view and we will begin negotiating with them because they're changing their view of America. So we decided, the second major point here is that we decided to engage with radical jihadists. What has the result been? The third point that Josh Earnest made this week is the major focus of our government today is to foster and build a relationship with the government of Libya to enable Libya to move forward. I think that is a laudable goal. There is one problem. There is not a government in Libya, Josh. There is not a government. It is kind of like Iraq and Syria. It is an ungoverned region. There is no central government. There are factions, there are tribes, there are different coalitions, and there is no government for us to build a new Libya with. All we have in Libya is an ungoverned zone that is exporting ideology, radical ideology. It is exporting fighters, it is exporting weapons into northern Africa and into the Middle East. It is a cesspool of radical jihadists, and that is the result of not confronting, not containing, and not putting in place the ultimate strategy of confronting, containing, and defeating radical jihadists. The great thing about the strategy that Frank and his group have outlined is we are going to identify the enemy. We recognize that this is a long war, and we are committed to fighting it, and we are committed to winning it, and we need to identify it for what it is. So that is how we have lost Libya, northern Africa, and fed to the crisis that is in Syria and in Iraq, and that's why we've dug a hole deeper rather than making progress because of these kinds of decisions. So thank you.
Well, you finished on the perfect segue note, Congressman Hoekstra. We're going to pivot from Libya and the debacle there, arising from primarily, I think, an absence of strategy and an absence of strategic vision about the nature of the enemy we're up against, to Syria, where we have a very similar kind of debacle unfolding. Did I say that right? Did I say Libya in the first instance, Syria in the second instance? That's what I meant. Libya under Pete Hoekstra. Elliot Chodoff is going to walk us through what's going on in Syria, something he is intimately familiar with as a noted political and military analyst based in Israel, a military strategist, a PhD from Chicago, a man who has, among other things, served with distinction in the Israel Defense Forces. In fact, he is still an active reserve officer in the IDF's Northern Command. He's also a lecturer in international relations at Haifa University. I had the privilege of spending much of the day with him yesterday in Florida and was treated to some very impressive analysis of the kinds of shifting tectonic plates, if you will, geostrategic tectonic plates that are at work here. What we're witnessing is, I suppose, the earthquakes that are developing along some of those fault lines, and I'm very grateful to him for joining us today to bring his expertise to bear and very nicely complement what Congressman Hoekstra has just said by talking about Syria. Welcome, Elliot. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here. That was the good news. Now we can talk about the bad news, right? Because in many ways, Syria is Libya on steroids for a few reasons. And before I go into the Syrian aspects of it, and Syria, I think, is maybe the only place where, from an Israeli perspective, you can stand in a spot on the Golan Heights and in a sweep of 120 degrees see Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, and some 50 jihadi organizations with the Syrian army in the mix in the middle. It's quite a menu. Frank mentioned before, I think the Congressman did as well, that there's no strategy, and I think there's a good reason for that, and you touched on it. There's no strategy because there's no objective, and there's no objective because there's no definition of who the adversary is and what they're doing. So what I'd like to do is look into what's happening in Syria in sort of it's a segue because after Libya fell apart, Syria began to fall apart on a grand scale. We're not facing anarchy, we're facing chaos. Anarchy has some structure to it. We've traded, and not by our choice, a structured enemy with a sense of entitlement in terms of loss aversion. I'm talking about the Assad regime, and when I talk about the Assad regime, I'm talking about father and son. By the way, if you want to read a really good book on the transition of power in Syria, read Mario Puzo's The Godfather. It's the story, right? Father's in control, grooming a son to take over. That son gets killed, brings in the other son who wanted to have nothing to do with it, changes the rules, and now we have the Bashar al-Assad regime. But even with the father, who is a vicious enemy, and the son, who is equally vicious but, let's say, less experienced, we were dealing with an adversary with whom we had a return address. We had a very interesting sort of bipolar situation on the border of Syria for decades, from 1974. And that was that it was either totally safe or war. And in fact, during that entire period, it was totally safe. In other words, you could go up to the border between countries at war with armies facing each other, knowing that nothing was going to happen because the Syrian regime had no interest in it happening. There was no fence on the Syrian border. There was no terrorism from Syria into Israel. He made his mischief in Lebanon. That was a story in and of itself. But that border was secure. Potentially very dangerous, but secure. And now we've traded it for chaos. And I say we've traded not by our volition, but by the reality. I want to break down what's happening in Syria in terms of its complexity and focus on a couple of points, because, again, this isn't even a short talk. It's not even a lecture. It's possibly a course or a degree. We talk about the Syrian civil war, and in focusing or labeling it the civil war, we miss most of what's going on there. So what I'd like to submit first and foremost is that we're talking about a civil war, a religious war, an ethnic war, an insurgency, a regional war, and a global war all at the same time. And if we understand that level of complexity, we also know that by pressing one of the buttons, we have no effect on any of the others, or if we do, in trying to solve one, we actually may exacerbate others. I want to focus on two aspects of that, of what I just said. First is the ethnic quality of the war, and the second is the sort of insurgency, regional, global aspect of it. We tend to think of what's going on in Syria in religious terms, and a lot of the talk about what's going on in the Middle East is in religious terms, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's not about Islam. But I think, once again, if we look at it purely in those terms, we miss major portions of what's happening. Part of it political, but in this case I want to talk about ethnic. Everybody knows that the Alawites, the Assad regime is an Alawite regime, are tied in with the Iranians who are Shiites. The Shiites are supporting them because the Shiites and the Alawites sort of have something to do with each other, which, by the way, they don't really. And by calling it religious, we also give it the sense that it's about differences of faith. They say the Shahada this way, they say the Shahada that way, and that's why they're murdering each other. So I'll submit, first of all, that a good deal of it has to do with internal power, but more importantly, the Alawites see themselves not only as a religious group, they are an ethnic group. This is key, because what makes ethnic war different from any other type of war is you can't change sides. In other words, unlike a political or an ideological war, you can't see the light. You can't quit. And by the way, here I should mention, wars end when the loser quits. The winner determines the outcome, the loser determines when. The Alawites, looking at what's happening around them, and the Alawites tend to be secular in the sort of scheme of the Muslim world. The Muslim world doesn't even consider them to be Muslims, they consider them to be heretics. The Alawites, looking at what's going on around them and the opposition to them, have come to a very interesting and a highly justified conclusion. And that is that if they lose, they're going to be massacred. And nobody's going to come to their rescue. In other words, what happened in Iraq with the oppression of the Sunni minority after the fall of Saddam, the response in the Sunni world was to come to their rescue. And that's part of what we're seeing in Iraq, Syria today. The Alawites know that that's not going to happen. So we have an interesting phenomenon. We have a population that makes up about 10% of the population of Syria. And by the way, I tell my students, if you ever want to lie and tell the truth at the same time, use percentages. Right? 10% doesn't sound like much. But if I say 2.5 million people, it's already a lot of people. So we have 2.5 million people who believe they'll be massacred if they lose or quit. They control the Air Force, they control major tank forces, special forces, some infantry units. They're backed by Hezbollah, Iran, and the Russians. Why should they quit? And they won't, and they don't. Another dirty little secret of that regime in terms of the sides taken up is that the second largest group within the Syrian regime are the secular Sunnis. In other words, here again, that division, the Sunnis are versus the Alawites, and the Shiites are supporting the Alawites because they're against the Sunnis. The second largest group within the regime are the secular Sunni business people in the middle class. Sort of flies in the face of what we have understood otherwise. Now, why do they support the regime? For a very simple reason. When the Sunni secular businessman comes home from work at the end of the day, he wants to do what every other businessman in the world wants to do at the end of the day. He wants to have his martini or the equivalent. If Al-Qaeda or ISIS takes over his country, he's not going to have it. I'm oversimplifying the point, but it's his lifestyle. He wants his wife to dress like Mrs. Assad, and if you haven't seen a picture of Mrs. Assad, look her up. She's a Vogue fashion model. Under ISIS, his wife is going to have a fashion choice. Black burqa, gray burqa, brown burqa. It's not what he wants. And they're supporting the regime. The bottom line on this is that they are not going to quit. And those who eulogized Assad, you remember at the beginning of the fighting, he's going to be gone in a week, in a month, in 2 months, and dragged on. Here I can say I'm generally a low-tech guy. Here I like the internet because there are lectures that I gave back then that said then he's not going to quit. And I'll take it a step further. And here, unlike Libya, even if he drops dead this minute, which wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, his regime isn't going anywhere. In other words, it's not going to fall apart like Saddam's regime, and it's not going to disintegrate like Gaddafi's regime. So this fight is going to go on. Beyond that, if we add the other aspect that I want to talk about, it is also not going to burn out. The Syrian conflict today is more global and less Syrian than any of the other fights going on around us. And each for their own interests. The Russians are getting involved now. I read recently that the White House is still trying to figure out what Putin is doing in Syria. They can give me a call. I'll help them out. Putin is expanding the Russian empire. He needs warm water ports. The Russians always needed warm water ports, and he's got them along the Syrian coast. It's very, very simple. The rest is icing on the cake. And he's not going to back down. America is pulling out of the region. Nature abhors a vacuum. The vacuum is being filled. Around that, we also have the imperial wannabes, in particular Iran, and those that are growing in the open spaces, and here I'm talking about the Islamic State. What's interesting is that if we take the Russians out of the picture, everybody else who's fighting in Syria is fighting essentially from the same ideology, and that is the radical Islamic ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. Whether it's the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the groups within the Sunni pantheon, they are all coming out of the same radical Islamic jihadi system, which means that they will fight each other to the death, but they have one thing in common, and that is that they all hate us. And I want to leave you with this thought, because if I had a really good answer, I would give it to you. What do you do with this mess? Sometimes you just sit back and watch it with all of the tragedy involved, and I mean that seriously. The official numbers of dead, I think, are tremendously underestimated. My estimate is somewhere in the neighborhood of 350,000. Displacement, refugees, and we know that what that's doing in Europe as well. It's reached the point where it is such chaos that the best I think that we can do is contain it rather than solve it. And sometimes we have to recognize, you know what, there are some problems you don't solve, but you do contain them. But recognizing who's behind it and recognizing that to a great extent there is no good guy in this game is also important in seeing what's going on in Syria. Pushing in and trying to fix a bad guy situation probably will only make it worse. On that note, thank you.
Thank you, Elliot, very much. And speaking of what do you do about it, we have as our cleanup batter my colleague at the Center for Security Policy, our Executive Vice President, Jim Hansen. Jim served in the U.S. Army Special Forces and actually engaged, as Elliot has done, in the old-fashioned kinetic kind of counter-jihad. He has been instrumental to the work that we're doing at the center on this issue as part of what we call our counter-jihad campaign. Jim took the basic plan of the Secure Freedom Strategy, which had as its broad purpose addressing the global jihad movement, and worked with colleagues, some of whom are still, I believe, in the system, working to try to secure us, to produce this book, Cut Down the Black Flag, a plan to defeat the Islamic State. You mentioned, Elliot, it is one of the elements at work now in Syria. It's much in evidence in Libya as well. In fact, we're seeing folks swearing allegiance to it in various places. It is one element of the global jihad movement, and Jim has helped define some very practical steps that we as a country could take to address much more effectively than we are today that particular part of the global jihad movement. I'm delighted to have him here to present his book, Cut Down the Black Flag, and then we will have a conversation among the three panelists and entertain questions as well. Jim, welcome. Thank you.
First thing I'd like to say is I am not deluded enough to think I have a plan that's going to fix this. All right, so let's get that on the table first of all. This is a mess of epic and, because of the location, almost biblical proportions. I would like to thank one person who made the fact that, to the extent that Cut Down the Black Flag is readable, it's because of the editing done by Samantha Narove, who is here with us, who edited the entire book and turned it into something vaguely resembling English. She's a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, paratrooper, and all-around stud. So thank you, Samantha. I'm going to focus on a very narrow portion of what may be able to be accomplished to do something productive in Iraq. We toppled a dictator in Iraq. We spent American blood and treasure to take out a bad guy. Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. He was doing bad things. He had conducted chemical warfare. He threatened his neighbors. And killing him eventually, as the Iraqi government did, was a net gain for planet Earth. The problem is, in every other instance, up until, I guess, Vietnam, when we went and toppled a government, or when we fought a war and created the opportunity for people to savor freedom and to live under their own democratic rule, we stayed to help. All right, we are still in Germany, Italy, Japan, and Korea. And unless I'm mistaken, those are all allies and those are all stable democracies. We went into Iraq, we killed Saddam Hussein's government, and then the Iraqi government killed him. And then when President Obama came to power, the first thing he did was pack up and leave. And as Elliot mentioned, in one of my favorite phrases, you can't end wars. The enemy gets a vote. The losing side has to accept that they lost. And in this case, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the insurgency, the people we were fighting in Iraq lost. And to some extent, they had accepted that. But what we had done is we had used some people in that country to help us. We used the Sunni tribes in Anbar province who knew the Al-Qaeda in Iraq people and helped us kill them. And we used the Kurds, and we used the promises we made to those two groups to convince them to help us in a coalition to give Iraq a chance at an actual government. That happened. There was a government seated in Iraq. It represented all the people, and it may never have turned into a stable democracy. but we'll never know, because the one thing that was necessary for that was adult leadership in that country, and the adults in the room, the United States, left. Now, again, as was mentioned, nature abhors a vacuum, tyrants abhor a vacuum. And anyone who was paying attention knew that as soon as there was a vacuum in Iraq, two groups would be enabled to fill it. One was what became ISIS, the former Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Sunni extremists who fly the black flag. The other, and even more dangerous than them, is Iran. Iran is the greatest threat in that region, and right now, the misguided policies of President Obama, who for some reason, and I am unable to fathom why, believes that the Iranian governments, the mullahs, the 12th imam believing theocratic lunatics, are somehow a force for peace. Now, they may be a force for peace if by peace you mean Iranian hegemony over the region and an iron sandal on the necks of all the people, backed up by the nuclear weapons he just enabled with this debacle of an Iran deal. I don't hold that view. I think that the worst thing that could possibly happen is for Iran to expand its power, for them to become the hegemon in the region, and for them to continue to fund terror and finish their bomb and use it for the bringing of the Islamic end times that their theocracy needs to fulfill its destiny. In the interest of not wanting that to happen, we need to do something that enables either what's left of the Iraqi government in Baghdad, which right now is essentially a puppet of the Iranian regime, and the few friends we may have in the region still, to help us kill ISIS. The very existence of an Islamic State flying the black flag in Iraq and Syria is anathema to peace. We cannot let them continue to do that. We cannot let them be a banner for recruiting. We cannot let them have an intercontinental caliphate with its headquarters there. That's why the book's called Cut Down the Black Flag. We need to knock them off their perch. We need to take them down. And in this case, I'm glad Elliot went before me and talked about Syria, because I got to be honest with you. I got no idea what to do there. All right, anyone who looked at me and told me they knew what to do in Syria right now, I would know is an unserious thinker. That is a mess beyond belief. Iraq, bad, but maybe not quite that bad. And I say Iraq, I'm not convinced there is an Iraq anymore. All right, the borders of that state may exist on maps, but the people in that country and the powers in that country no longer exist as a federal republic, Islamic republic, or country of Iraq in any meaningful way. The Kurds have had what amounts to a nation state for years now. The Kurds are our friend. The Kurds are people who like America. They have worked with America, and they want our help. They want Kurdistan, is what they want. And they'll start with Iraqi Kurdistan, which they've established, which has oil deals with Turkey, which is a viable, functional organization and country for all intents and purposes. We should be giving them arms, support, training, and operating with them to kill as many ISIS terrorists, Daesh, all the bad guys that we can. And the fact that we're not, and the fact that we're not honoring the promises we made that convinced them to work with us to win the Iraq war is a disgrace. So the Baghdad government is not honoring those promises. The Baghdad government is not delivering military aid, supplies, and support that were promised to the Kurds, and they keep for themselves because they don't want a strong Kurdistan. So we need to change that. If we have to go around Baghdad to do that, good. Baghdad's not our friend anymore. Baghdad is a city and a government that is beholden to Iran and not someone we should be dealing with. So number one, arm and work with the Kurds. The second piece that I think we may still be able to do, and it relates to the fact that the Sunni in Iraq no longer in any viable way consider themselves part of an Iraq that is run by Iran. So we convinced the tribes in Anbar province to work with us to kill al-Qaeda in Iraq and to win the Iraq war. Then we left them to the tender mercies of the Baghdad government, who treated them like the dogs they consider them. They did not deliver aid. They did not deliver reconstruction projects. They did not deliver military supplies and any help at all. We promised they would. We left. It didn't happen. If we want to kill ISIS and topple the black flag, it exists in Anbar province, and we need the same tribes that don't want them there any more than we do to help. We need Army Special Forces in there training, equipping, and operating with them so they can identify the ISIS locations, the ISIS supporters, and root them out and kill them. We need to kill terrorists and stack them like cordwood until they no longer operate in those regions. If we do that, then we may have at least something resembling stability in the Sunni regions of what was formerly Iraq. Now, it's fair to ask, why in the world would those guys trust us again? I mean, they did it once and they got burned badly. And now they're under ISIS's tender mercies because of that. Well, I think one of the ways you could induce them to do that is to give them what the UN loves to say everyone should have, self-determination. All right, Iraq was an artificial construct of the post-colonial era. Sunni, Kurds, and Shia living in absolute disharmony. All right, there's no reason for that. Kurdistan is a viable entity. I don't have any idea whether a Sunni-run region would be anything other than a mess, but if we at least promise them the opportunity to try, they may help us kill ISIS, and I think that's a risk worth taking. So that's the second leg of the triad. And the third is, if we are going to be part of this operation, the United States military needs to take the handcuffs off and act like killing terrorists is a good idea again. It never went out of style for me and my friends, okay? Elliot and everybody else, we all are firm believers that the best tango is a dead tango. But we don't act that way. The restrictions on airstrikes, the process of getting an airstrike approved, the fact that our military who are training the Iraqi forces and working with the Kurds and to some extent working with the Sunni can't even leave our bases to accompany them on combat operations and provide command and control and call in airstrikes. That's absurd, okay? It relates to President Obama's decision that he was going to end that war. Well, he ended U.S. active participation in that war. As we've discussed, he didn't end the war because the enemy got a vote. So if we're going to go ahead and do that, that is the third piece we need to do. Turn loose. We got to cry havoc and let loose the dogs of war. And if we do those three things, I am not crazy enough to guarantee that's going to work. But I can tell you right now, it will work infinitely better than leading from behind, as President Obama has been doing since he cut and ran from Iraq in the first place.
Take that chair and move things around a little bit. Now, I understand I'm to move this microphone. Is that the idea? To our seated position, and we will continue the conversation. Jim, maybe we could slide you up here, and we'll just put one more chair over here. This is a movable feast, in a manner of speaking. I want to say thank you to all three of you, Pete Hoekstra, Elliot Chodoff, and Jim Hansen, for shedding some important light on the vexing problems that we're confronting most immediately in the Middle East, though hardly exclusively there, and for some insights into an application of the broader strategy to the challenge posed most immediately by the Islamic State. I want to open it up to questions and comments from the assorted, esteemed colleagues that we've got with us today. Maybe I could just throw to all three of you by way of introduction, though, an issue that I know is near and dear particularly to Elliot's heart, and that is something that Jim has sort of touched on in connection with betraying some of those who stood with us, more or less, in that case, the Sunnis in Iraq, the Kurds in Iraq. But Israel really is, of course, such an incredibly important and vital ally for the United States in this dangerous strategic environment. I'd like to kind of get your respective views on how the United States has involved itself with Israel at this point, particularly, and to what extent might a better plan and strategy vis-a-vis Israel be an incredibly important part of having a better outcome in each of these areas. And Elliot, maybe we could start with you, get your perspective on the ground there.
Well, I think the starting point would be that the American-Israeli relationship has become complex in the sense that it's said, and I think correctly, that America and Israel have never been closer, and that's true on an institutional level. In other words, the institutional relationship has simply improved over time. We've gotten closer, shared interests on the political level as well, but on the institutional level. And that, to a great extent, transcends the vagaries of electoral politics. I'll try to be circumspect. That doesn't mean that the commander-in-chief doesn't have a say, and that as president or as commander-in-chief. And I personally think that the trickiness, the danger, has been much more in perception than necessarily in reality, but perception counts. An enemy that believes that America will not stand by, whether America will or will not ultimately, is one who's more likely to take a shot. Those who are familiar with the lead up to the North Korean invasion of 1950 know that in part it was of a perception that America did not consider South Korea to be part of its vital interest. So those sort of things concern me more than, and the messages of those, more than the practical end, because ultimately America and Israel are close and working that way. Let me also add that I think that even close allies and close friends, and I think that the relationship is more friendship than alliance, as in the sense of there's a closeness that transcends the formality of an alliance. Even close friends can have different interests, not necessarily opposing interests, that do lead to some divergence between them. I don't find that particularly concerning as long as the friendship remains a friendship.
You're so kind.
I know.
You are so kind.
I'm not often called that.
Yeah, and I'd like to be able to share that, but I think the story's much uglier than that. Okay. In that the friendship clearly endures, but a friendship only endures, or it has to endure over time. If you start taking a look at the polling numbers here in the United States, you'll find that the younger generations here in the United States do not share the same kind of level of support and perceived relationship and the strength of the relationship between the United States and Israel. And I think that is a huge and that is a significant problem. And I think part of that is now being shaped by this president and this administration. Because just as they have sent signals to, during the Green Revolution, they sent signals to Iran that we're with the government, we're not with the people in the streets, which the Iranian government said, well, maybe we can negotiate with these guys. And they found out maybe we don't even have to negotiate that hard and we can get what we want. They sent a clear signal to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that said, maybe we're not okay with Mubarak. Maybe we're okay with the Muslim Brotherhood, which has, so the Muslim Brotherhood comes into power. And we've all seen what that has done to Sinai and, taken a stable border, a stable relationship, and cast that into doubt. Then, what we talk about in the book is we sent a signal to the radical jihadists that maybe getting rid of Gaddafi. Now, that doesn't have a direct impact, but again, it's that signal that says, hey, the relationships are different. And then we did it with Assad. You know, maybe it's okay to overthrow Assad, which then jeopardizes Israel on its northern border. And you know, so you've got this out of this administration. Almost every policy that we have pursued and every regime that we have supported or regime change that we have supported has either worsened our relationship between the U.S. and Israel or has created greater instability and greater threat to Israel in the region. And you know, when you take a look at the friends that, or the borders that you used to have, there was relative stability, or you know, bipolar. You either knew if you were at war or not. You know, the only relationship that is still enduring that we've maintained throughout this whole process is the relationship with Jordan. And Jordan is probably at great risk at this point as well, with Palestinians, Iraqi refugees, and now Syrian refugees, how long that administration will be able to stay in power. So thank you for being so kind to us as a country, but we feel your pain.
From your lips to God's ears.
Yeah.
And I'll join with Pete and point out it's been embarrassing to me as an American to have to wait for Prime Minister Netanyahu to come address our Congress to hear some common sense about actions in the region, to hear some common sense about Iran and common sense about the threat we all face. I think President Obama has treated both Israel and the Prime Minister disgracefully. And I think more importantly and more dangerously, he has furthered the idea that the enemies we face do not have a common cause. They do. Their common cause is jihad. They are Islamic supremacists, and they're unbashful about saying it. They'll tell you. They admit it, and they are supported by Al-Azhar, the Saudi entity that is the arbiter of what is Islamic. You got President Obama telling them they're not Islamic, and you've got Al-Azhar, the actual authority, saying they are. They are Islamic jihadists. They have a goal. Their goal is global domination. And our president has made both Israel and the world less safe by working at making that an unreality. By trying to pretend that that's not the case, he's made us all less safe.
Well said. I think you mean the Saudi-backed Egyptian Al-Azhar University, but we knew what you meant. Let me open the floor to questions or comments. Admiral Lyons.
Yeah, let me
Bring this around, as I say, very much a movable feast.
thank you, Frank, and thank all of you for your comments this morning. America, under the influence and input from the Muslim Brotherhood, sequestration was the perfect storm. It provided the legal means for the unilateral disarmament of our military. The restricted rules of engagement, the sacrificing of our people. This is all part of it. You know, and Sven, where did Sven go? I just see him left. I'm not sure to this day the Bush administration understands what they did when they invaded Iraq without first taking care of the major cancer in Tehran. And before that event happened, I went in, I saw Swen, I was trying to convince Wolfowitz, you're going in the wrong country. You had full justification, as I've been trying to wipe out for 35 years, these ragheads in Tehran. But until we face up to the fact exactly what we're dealing with, you can put every strategy out in the world, but if we don't win next year, we're in a pile of deep kimchi. And with that, I'll pass this on.
Admiral, thank you. There's always a very exciting moment when Admiral Lyons takes the microphone.
And I've waited for a long time to be able to say this, and you know, you're absolutely wrong.
There's a bold statement.
In that, I think at least we'd agree with you. this administration does have a strategy. I articulated it as one in saying they know exactly what they're doing, and they're very good at doing it. This is not a novice president. And all I'm saying is we agree with you that he does have a strategy, and you saying that we're wrong isn't accurate.
I think you're dead on. I think Obama has attempted to fundamentally transform the country culturally and to put us at one among many status in the world. The United States is still the world's policeman. When the world dials 911, the phone rings at the Pentagon. The problem is right now it goes to voicemail. And that's unfortunate for us and for the rest of the world.
I do think there's a strategy. I think, however, it's an extension. There's been a change in the perspective of that strategy, but unfortunately, I'll go with you on the error of the Bush administration, and I'll double down on it. Not only did he go into Iraq and Afghanistan, he thought he could do it on the cheap. So it left us in a position, not only I wouldn't say going after the wrong enemy, because as you pointed out, I think that taking out Saddam Hussein was a great thing for the world. I'm saying not the wrong guy, just the wrong order. Okay. But thinking that the whole thing could be done on the cheap with an already under-strength U.S. military and telling America you can go shopping, we'll take care of it, leads us into where we are today.
I think this shows that collectively, the three of us almost equate to your intellect. All right? The three of us combined can take you on. Individually, no way.
That's a high compliment. Claire Lopez, the Center for Security Policy.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to ask Elliot. You outlined a strategy for the United States and the former Syria that correlates to a great extent along what I've been trying to promote for quite a while. And I heard you use the term that we should implement a policy of containment around the whole mess. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit on what you would what you mean by that.
I don't mean containment in the classic sense of the Soviet period. There, you have essentially the antithesis in terms of structure. There was a return address. We knew what the edges were. They may not have been absolutely sharp, but at least there was a gray line around the edge, and that was meant to be contained in the sense that the Soviets were expansionist and they were to be prevented from expanding. Good old-fashioned geographical strategy. Here, there's a tendency to think that we can solve the internal issue of Syria, not among, but it's sort of, what can we do to solve it? And the answer is, at the moment at least, nothing. And therefore, containing it in the more amorphous sense of not letting it spread, of identifying the most dangerous aspects of it to us, and by here I mean the collective us, the United States, Israel, the Western world, and Islamic State is certainly one of those aspects. Not necessarily on a level of, and by the way, Hezbollah as well, maybe more so. Ask me the same question 6 months from now, I may give you a different answer, but certainly those, because of their global reach, their global aspirations, Hezbollah's global aspirations as an extension, as a proxy of Iran's, and here I certainly agree, Iran, I think we can't repeat it enough. So containing it in the sense of weakening those factors, trying to keep them as local as possible, and of course, for America, local is different. You're keeping it away from America means keeping it in my backyard and front yard. But that's the containment that I'm talking about, not the physical, geographical again, of the classical Cold War period. Weakening those who are reaching out globally, striking them as hard as possible, and understanding, I think, that at least in where we are today, this is not a problem we're going to solve. It's one that we're going to have to manage.
For those of you watching via the live stream, we're trying to adjust the lighting a little bit here because we have this magnificent backdrop, which is much in evidence, and the speakers are not quite as much in evidence as one would like. Ben Lerner, also with the Center for Security Policy.
Thank you. Putting Israel aside for a moment, I wanted to ask a question about providing military hardware to some of our shakier allies in the region. From what I understand, Jordan has requested drones from us, and from what I understand, we have not yet agreed to that request. And on one hand, I can understand if we have not yet agreed to that request. I've been hearing for the better part of 15 years that Jordan's about to go, and you hear a lot more of that these days. On the other hand, though, how can we expect the Jordanians to actually defend themselves from threats like ISIS if we don't give them some of the good stuff? So the question is, and it's really beyond Jordan, in general, how do you solve that dilemma? Because you don't want our good stuff to fall into the wrong hands, but you don't want there to be an issue of wrong hands to be fallen into in the first place.
Any volunteers for that challenging question? Jim?
I think if we're going to, we generally get into a situation where we're dealing with the worst least option for friends. All right, we don't have a lot of friends. We have one really good friend in Israel. We have a second potentially pretty good friend in the Kurds. Other than that, we have variations of frenemies and enemies that we deal with as we need to in the great global chess game. I think to the extent that we want Iran to be opposed, that we want ISIS to get squashed, that we want these people we are trying to at least maintain a cordial, potentially useful relationship with to work with us, we give them the good toys. You know, and we've done that always with the Saudis and with other people who we don't really trust, but we're asking them to do things for us. In return, they get F-15s, they get drones, they get things like that. So I think a part of the president's deal to get the Iran deal past the Gulf Arab states was to promise them some new toys, and rightfully so. He's empowering what is essentially their biggest enemy. All right, they're smart enough to know that the real problem is Iran, and we'll continue to say that. So by giving them at least the tools to hopefully deter, I mean, I would like to think Obama's plan is a giant détente of some sort, a place where there is a power balance between the Shia and Sunni in the region, and nobody fights. Well, that's absurd for anyone who actually understands what's going on there, but that's what he's trying to do. So giving the guys who are on the other side of the equation something to oppose Iran with now makes sense.
I would describe Jordan as being better than a frenemy.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, okay.
They're
They're friends, and so you know, we give Jordan what they need to maintain stability and to also confront the threats that they face. The Kurds, I think, are a wonderful example. Here's where they are being outgunned by ISIS, and ISIS has U.S. weapons. ISIS has the
off the battlefield from our Iraqi allies
as they ran, but you know, so you know, and the Kurds are taking casualties. They've had over 1,000 killed in action. They're now going after, you know, they've mounted the offensive in Sinjar over the last couple of days. They've had that, and so I'm sure they're taking significant casualties there again. But it has been unconscionable that, you know, this administration has said the only way that the Kurds will get weapons is if the weapons go through Baghdad, and Baghdad approves the weapons going up to the Kurdish region. And you know, and the bottom line is they haven't been getting what they need to even be on level footing with ISIS. And I think the other thing is the rules of engagement. Well, Frank and I had an opportunity to meet with a young man who was just in Kurdistan. And, so we have an administration that says, well, we've got special ops in Kurdistan. They're helping the Kurds. It's kind of like the guy saying, don't put me anywhere near the front because I've got both hands tied behind my back. And then the almost criminal action of sending 50 special ops forces into Syria. And people will say, they're debating about, is that enough or not? No, sending 50 in for 60 days at a time is a ludicrous military strategy. But more importantly, I wonder what their rules of engagement are. And my guess, their rules of engagement are find the thickest wall, the deepest bunker, and spend 60 days in there and make sure you don't get hurt. And when your 60 days are over, get in your armored vehicle and go back to Turkey, and we'll send 50 more in because their rules of engagement have been awful. I don't know if you've got, okay.
Anybody else?
Can I say something on that? I'm just picking up on Pete's.
Only if you say I'm right.
I'd like to ask whether I really have a choice, Admiral, but you have responsibility.
It's really atrocious what's gone on with the rules of engagement going back years. And I mean, we've just sacrificed so many people and forever tremendous injuries. But let me say this. We have a military leadership. It's called the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Every one of them, as far as I know, had to sign off on them. This is atrocious. I've always maintained that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as a corporate body, and this goes back to the Johnson years, if they would have stood up and taken the position that they knew was the right military strategy and actions we should have taken, and if they wouldn't bring the president around, they submitted that resignation, living up to their oath of office, no president could withstand that. And until we find the leadership with that type of background, of course, they don't get put in that position if they have that type of background. But that's what it's going to take. I mean, this is just criminal what's going on. I mean, it's really treason in another form. That's the way I view it.
Dereliction of duty.
Coming up to the end of the table, happy to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I apologize. I didn't get to hear all of your presentations, and mine might come from a different background. I used to do international business, and I've always noticed if you really want to cripple any kind of an entity, you go after the money. As I understand it, ISIS is ranked as one of the wealthiest, richest insurgency in the world. And their monies presumably come from the oil, but they sell their oil at a quarter of the market rate. They also have the antiquities. So they're selling those antiquities on the market, global market, and they are adept at the slave trade, human trafficking, that sort of thing. So has anyone thought of going after ISIS through the financial markets in some way?
Well, I might just at least allude to it. The perhaps most important piece of the Reagan strategy for taking down the Soviet Union, as Mike Maloof remembers from his time in the Pentagon as well, was going after their ability to sustain themselves as an enterprise, shall we say, but also as a military endeavor. And that meant taking down their ability to earn hard currency through a number of economic warfare measures and preventing them from getting ready access to the high technology that enabled much of their military to be competitive. And this was really not a containment strategy. This was a rollback strategy. This was aimed at taking them down. As Reagan famously put it, as the essence of his strategy, we win, they lose. There has been a lot of work over the years, notably with respect to Iran, but also other terrorist entities, usually led, I think it's fair to say, Pete, by the Treasury Department, to try to identify, funding streams and roll them up. I think probably the single most effective one ever was the one they used on South Korea, with the Delta something or other, Delta Bank Asia. Thank you, Fred. That really very, very dramatically pulled their chain. There's been talk about doing some of that with respect to the Islamic State, but I think it's also correct that some of what they're doing that is raising funds locally is stuff that may not be as susceptible to swift, monitoring or controls or the like that we could be using much more effectively against a nation state, for example, like Iran. Elliot?
I'd just like to continue what Frank was saying. First of all, I'd make a different distinction than one that is normally made. We normally talk about states and non-state actors. And I think that dichotomy is no longer fully applicable. We can talk about more coherent and less coherent. I prefer to use terms like institutionalized. In other words, rather than labeling them. Because let's face it, what's more of a state today? Hamas or Iraq? Or let's take Libya as an example. Right? Hamas is more state-like. It's more institutionalized. So we have the more coherent end in Iran, I think, falls, and then the Soviet Union certainly fell there. First of all, has more responsibility to its population, and I certainly don't say that in democratic terms, but in terms of if it's going to use its population as a source of extraction, it has to deal with them. They're more vulnerable. They're also much more power-based in the classical sense, and of course the Soviet Union much more so, in that it was an industrial warfare kind of an entity. That's a very expensive way of doing business. If we take at the other end of the spectrum, Islamic State, we're talking about a non-institutionalized system. Their population really means nothing to them, which means that if their budget, if you will, gets hit, the people will suffer. Heck, the people are suffering already. They don't care. They also have the ability to drop back in terms of their military capability. They're not fielding forces of armor and air. I mean, they picked up a few tanks along the way, but that's not a real armor force. So they can drop back. Al-Qaeda even more so. Al-Qaeda isn't even an organization, it's a network. So on the one hand, let's say on the action end, yes, pressuring them any which way is a good thing because it's good to do it. But to think that that's what's going to ultimately solve it with them, I think not. They've got too many sources on the one hand and too much resiliency on the other hand for that to be a victory strategy.
Can I say one thing on Islamic State? They, as Frank mentioned, they don't have the giant financial entanglements that we can get the Treasury Department involved in sanctioning and that. But they're selling oil. And you can blow that up. Quite literally. You can stop them from doing that by blowing it up. The old-fashioned way. We did it in World War II. What did we do? We hit the industrial might of Germany directly to stop them from doing things we didn't want them to do. So to the extent that we can identify ISIS targets that they're using for military operations or for wealth-generating and state-sustaining operations, we should destroy them. And the fact that it may end up that Russia does that because they were insane enough to poke the bear and blow an airplane out of the sky and start talking smack to Vladimir Putin. It's one thing to talk smack to President Obama, all right? But I'll be perfectly honest with you, Putin's a different animal. And blowing up his airplane and saying you're now going to do stuff in Russia may spur them to do what we have failed to do, and that's conduct something vaguely resembling warfare against the Islamic State.
Backfield's in motion to Fred Fleitz, also with the Center for Security Policy.
Thank you. Congressman Hoekstra, your book came out strategically just before the Benghazi committee hearing, and I wanted to ask you about that. The committee's been heavily criticized for the way it's done its work, but I think the committee hearing with Hillary Clinton's appearance really emphasized how this administration was really clueless about the threat from the global jihad movement, was clueless about the security situation in Benghazi, and that this administration engaged in a massive deception of the American people about the nature of the attack on the Benghazi consulate to win the election. We know Hillary Clinton knew this was a terrorist attack hours after it happened, and then she lied about it when the remains of some of the people killed arrived at Dover Air Force Base. I'm just wondering, what's your reaction to the Benghazi hearing in light of your book, and what did we learn about this administration's approach to the global jihad movement?
Could I just, while I'm carrying the mic back and forth, ask you to address explicitly the question, and you've all, in your ways, with Admiral Lyon's encouragement, talked about the administration having actually a strategy. I wonder whether clueless is the right term. It certainly explains how they've behaved, but I have the feeling that it reflected really a very concerted policy approach, an affinity for the Muslim Brotherhood, the enemies of Gaddafi, the enemies of Assad, and so on, that may have obscured reality as they saw it, but it was not that they were, unaware of what they were doing with respect to enhancing the prospects for the Brotherhood. Would you address that too?
I wish I would have walked out of watching those hearings the same way that you did. In that I'm not sure that they really hit the key points. I thought it was, it was, excuse me, it was interesting that, the key point, or one of the key points was the Secretary of State emailing her daughter that night and saying it was a terrorist attack and Al-Qaeda-like attack, and for her and the rest of the administration for telling America, for telling the families and others for a period of a couple of weeks that, well, we really think it was our fault. It was a video that was produced in Los Angeles, and we're going to make sure that we prosecute this guy, and this guy ends up in jail. It's like, well, wait a minute, okay? But the problem is that was buried in the hearing. I think it was a couple of hours into the hearing before that actually came up, and you've got 11 hours of hearings, and you and I have done these types of things together. You've got to drive a message, and you've got to drive it early, and you've got to drive it hard, and you've got to drive it repeatedly, especially when you've got a media that is biased in favor of supporting the narrative that's been coming from this administration. The second thing that happens is they never really asked the larger question, which I think would have shown how naive, or would have exposed their strategy for what they were trying to do. It's, why did you actually go into Libya in the first place? What was it in America's national security interest that we were going to take an island of stability in northern Africa, as evil as Gaddafi had been, but why were we going to take that, especially after, theoretically, the lessons learned in Iraq? Were you going to go and topple one more regime? Which was clearly the intent. This was not about stopping a genocide. We could have done that very easily by creating a safe zone around Benghazi and Derna, like we did for the 10 to 13 years that we protected the Kurdish regime in northern Iraq. If this was about genocide, we could have stopped that, but it was clear from the intent that we were going to overthrow the regime, get rid of Gaddafi, and leave these folks take over their country who we believe we could manage, control, and trust, and they were radical jihadists, and that, I think, would have exposed their strategy, that these were the folks. And I think this is, I think the CIA, I got to believe the CIA in Benghazi and Libya understood the threat. But I think this administration refused to believe that the people that attacked us that night in Benghazi would actually do that, because these are the people that they've been arming and training for the last 12 to 18 months to get rid of Gaddafi. And that, the committee never really looked at who actually attacked us and what were they doing the last 12 months. And I think we'd find out that the last 12 months they were going through, some training seminars with NATO. They were getting trained on weapons that we provided them, and those types of things. And then I think the other thing that the committee has not done that I wish that they would do is, it's been a highly classified program, but follow the weapons. What weapons and who provided weapons into Libya? The secretary has come out and said she wasn't aware of any weapons program, or wasn't operating any weapons program. The chairman of the Intel committee said the CIA wasn't doing one. The speaker, the then Speaker of the House said, I don't remember getting briefed on a program, which doesn't mean there wasn't a program. It just, I can't recall being briefed on one. But in my experience on the Intel Committee, the Gang of Eight, all of those words lead me to the 20 questions, in that there were weapons flowing into Libya and then out of Libya into Turkey, over to Syria, and into the people that are now ISIS, and the people, and no one's been able to ask exactly the right question, and everybody's been able to answer it, quote unquote, truthfully, but it's only because the question was about 3 degrees off of what actually really happened. And the only place, I don't know how we're going to get to the bottom of it, whether it's going to be somebody internally finally leaking to the media, or maybe this committee finally stepping up to the task and exposing it. There's no reason why it can't be talked about at this point. Libya is gone. Syria is in chaos. The key players in it, the Gang of Eight, many of them are now have moved on to different things. They can't, so expose what role the U.S. actually played, and who shipped weapons, whether it was Qatar, whether it was UAE. But there were weapons going in and out, and we were all a part of it, and we were always shipping it to the wrong people.
I think Pete just asked, and just one thing to follow up. Pete just answered the other main question about Benghazi. Why didn't we mount a rescue? All right, I'll tell you why. It's because they didn't want that to come out. They were hoping that this would not blow up as big as it did, and they would not have to let the world see that we had an operation going on in Benghazi that we probably shouldn't have had it going on. And consequently, there was no rescue mission authorized. There were some alert orders that went out, but the president never gave cross-border authority to any military unit to move into Libya. And that simple fact says that they were not going to do what they needed to do to save the Americans who were there on somebody's orders. And it really would be nice to know whose.
Well, of course, I have a different version.
We'll await another day with that. But let me just say, Jim, you made the point that this was their hope to sort of keep this from coming out or blowing up or whatever word you used. That actually worked pretty much like a top for the period that mattered, which was getting them through the subsequent 6 weeks or so. Claire Lopez, who has been following that whole story very closely, is that the subject of your question too?
It is. Thank you, Frank. From the perspective of the Citizens Commission on Benghazi, on which both Admiral Ace Lyons and I have been serving for a couple of years now, and Congressman Hoekstra, you've been affiliated with helping us as well. I wanted to follow up on that question of the motivation of the administration for going after Gaddafi. And you mentioned the ideological motivation of the Obama White House to install Muslim Brotherhood governments across the region, and that's certainly pretty clear. I haven't read your book yet, but I'm looking forward to it shortly. So I don't know if it's addressed in there, but did you look at perhaps a second motivation that really solidified the administration in the policy of overthrowing Gaddafi? And I think, Ace, chime in also if you would, there was another motivation, I think, in the administration besides ideological, and I think that comes from the Clinton State Department, and that motivation was business oriented. There were those like Sidney Blumenthal and others, apparently, around Secretary of State Clinton and the Clinton Foundation, who thought that they were going to benefit massively financially from business deals after the overthrow of Gaddafi. Is that something that you looked into?
It's not covered in the book. It may be the addendum in the next publishing of the book, because I think there's two, at least a couple of economic interests here. Number one, the one that has gained more visibility over the last few months, which is the potential economic benefit to supporters of the Clinton of Team Clinton. The other is the economic impact, specifically with France. That France was seeing the economic tide in Libya going in a different direction than what they wanted, where the French would benefit. And the French and the Brits were the great motivators and the movers behind getting rid of Gaddafi. And there's indications now that for both of them it was much more about economics than 20 years of pent-up hatred, although that was also a factor. And so that's another tale that needs to be told, or needs to at least be developed and explored more.
One other facet of this, I think, is of course the Gaddafi's revenge. Having, I think you've pointed this out, Claire, warned that there would be an invasion of Europe coming from his part of the world in due course. A demographic hijra, I think, is the Islamist term for it. The French, and to some extent the Brits, certainly the Germans and others in Europe, are now reaping the whirlwind, in part. It's another addendum for the book if it's not there. You got that one in this book? Here you go, Pete.
Well, not that specific quote, but what Gaddafi wrote in a letter in March of 2011 to the president: "You will regret it if you take a step towards intervening in our internal affairs."
You covered the truce negotiations in your book.
Somewhat, yes. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Up, one down here.
Hi, I'm Andrew Herod, an independent researcher and writer. I was interested, I guess there's been some talk, as I and others have advocated, of kind of a balkanization of these Iraq and Syria, these various entities, Kurds, Sunni, Shiites. What in particular do the panelists think are the prospects for that in, say, Syria? And you mentioned, Elliot mentioned the sort of ferocity of these groups that want to keep on fighting, but I guess maybe perhaps the Alawites might be willing at some point to concede that they'll retreat into an enclave, and then perhaps maybe we could somehow get the Sunnis in Syria to also be willing to settle for something. What prospects are they there for in Syria in particular, and also well in Iraq as well?
The short answer is somewhere between slim and none. The reason for it, I think you mentioned, Jim, the post-colonial Middle East, very often referred to as Sykes-Picot, the agreement that was signed between the British and French. and dividing up the Middle East after World War I, it's common to say that Sykes-Picot has failed. I think that's an understatement. I think Westphalia in the Middle East has failed. In other words, the idea of dividing the Middle East into nation states or into sovereign states, let's start with that, is deeper than Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot was dividing it up between Britain and France to their needs. What I see is that the entire attempt to export the European state system into the Middle East has failed. And therefore, we're not talking about rearranging the pieces. There are no pieces. Now, I think there are a number of reasons, and I think it's way too soon to state definitively why it failed. But certainly, among them, the absence of national identities, and I think Iraq is a classic, but so is Syria. The one exception, by the way, and I don't think it's a coincidence, is Egypt. And that's because there was an Egypt before there was any of this. So what we're seeing is simply a continuation of a national identity. We'll see in Iran because there was a Persia before there was any of this. We'll see a Turkey because there was a Turkey before there was any of this. But all the rest is an attempt to impose a system, you know what, impose is overstating it, export a system that worked in Europe into a region where it simply failed, totally. So the idea that it's going to reconstitute itself in some other configuration, I think, is extremely optimistic. More likely, we're going to see a consolidation into zones, and the Alawites are classic in that sense, the coastal area that we talk about. But the idea that there's going to be some sort of a neat border there, as European borders are understood, I don't see that happening. If I can just add what I talked about last night, what I see is that the Middle East is turning into a 19th century style imperial system with the resurrection of empires, the Persians, the Ottomans, the Egyptians, the Russians moving in, and not a state system as Europe has been since 1648.
I'm kind of disappointed you asked the question. I'm about 90% working through an op-ed on exactly that issue. And so I hope nobody watches this until Tuesday. It's live stream. Yeah, it's too late, and someone else is. But I agree because because the nation state, it's not only evolving in the Middle East, it's also evolving in Europe. Okay, with the Eurozone and all of those types of things, and but the export of the European model in the Middle East has not worked. And you can't balkanize, and I focused initially on Iraq, because you actually would have, you go to a Shia, Sunni, and a Kurdish region, okay, a zone. You'd actually, if you did that or created 3 more nation states, you'd actually have to draw the border around Kirkuk, which is almost going to be impossible to do because you're drawing around oil wells. And everybody's going to want the oil well. And so this line is really, really important, whereas you could see a super federated kind of thing where you have a very weak central government, loosely defined zones, but this is this is Kurdistan, this is the Sunni area, and we're not going to draw a border firmly. So all we at that point really need to do is define a revenue sharing for this oil, and so there's going to be some evolution, but believing that they're going to be European-style nation states is not going to work.
All right, I'll play the wild-eyed optimist. I'll go with why not. First of all, yes, Sykes-Picot failed. Yes, Westphalia failed. Yes, all the things you said are absolutely correct. But it was tried in the context of artificial lines drawn on a map, not lines drawn based on the populations contained within them. So you've got tribal cultures that do exist. You've got tribal identities. You had artificial nation states, including multiple tribes who hated each other, included in those borders, attempting to make a national identity out of people who were much happy cutting each other's throats. So I don't think there's a limit, given the number of tiny, unimpressive nations currently in the United Nations, why we couldn't have tribally based nation states for everybody in that region. And I would put the Sunni into one large bunch and let them fight it out, because they would. You give the Alawites a nice chunk of the good coastal land and do that. And I think you're going to have to, obviously, to do some revenue sharing to take care of the fact that the Sunni wouldn't have the oil. All right, so you're going to have to pay them off somehow. And maybe the Saudis or somebody else with a lot of money and oil pays them off to stay quiet in their little state. But I don't see why the fact that it didn't work in a really stupid way and a bad idea means you shouldn't give the people who like each other nation states and let them argue internally as opposed to with their neighbors who they hate inside a larger construct.
I have the pessimistic last one.
Please do, because you're going to be right being pessimistic.
A couple of quick answers. First of all, you're right. There are many small states in the United Nations. We refer to most of them as failed states. Second, when you say give them independence, giving somebody independence, and I'll throw the Palestinians into this mix as well, giving someone independence is a contradiction in terms. Nobody gives you independence, you take it. And the idea that what you said was essentially a more, I hate to use the word progressive, but variation of Sykes-Picot. In other words, we're going to give them independence because we... I know. You're welcome. Don't take it personally. And last but not least, the idea of revenue sharing and all of that supposes another virtual impossibility, and that is cooperation. So given those three, I love your optimism.
Last optimistic word, you said imposed, and it was not imposed. So if we imposed it on them and there was an external entity forcing them to act like nation states, we'd have a better shot in my progressive world.
Well, just as Jim Hansen has never been called a progressive, we've never been called an optimistic operation. So on that, I think we have to bring this to a close before it gets away from us altogether. I want to thank our terrific presenters. Congressman Pete Hoekstra, congratulations again on your terrific book, Architects of Disaster, The Destruction of Libya. Please get it at Amazon. We have copies of it for you here in the room. Jim Henson, Cut Down the Black Flag, a plan to defeat the Islamic State. Ilya Chodov, we're very delighted to have you. Without a book, come back when you have another one. There's another one in the works. Good. And not least, the Secure Freedom Strategy. We hope you'll take a fresh look at it in light of what we've talked about today. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for our terrific cameraman who's made the best under these challenging lighting circumstances. You did see the Capitol, and we appreciate you joining us through this live stream at Breitbart. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.